The dhikr of Allah, the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is the beautiful thing in this life, is the joy for the believers. And if there is any reward that a person can think of when it comes to the dhikr and the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, nothing is close to the reward that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would make remembrance of that individual, the one that make remembrance of Allah. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will mention the name of this one that is engaged in the dhikr, in the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, nothing is the like of Him subhanahu wa ta'ala, and He is as-sami'u al-basir. So when it comes to the rewards, it's beyond what a person can comprehend. And this is not something that we say from our own selves. This is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Qur'an. فَاذْكُرُونِ أَذْكُرْكُمْ وَاشْكُرُوا لِي وَلَا تَكْفُرُونَ. That means make remembrance of me, I would make remembrance of you. And the remembrance, that means that your name will be mentioned. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will praise you as a result of making remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is also one of the means of being grateful to Allah, and don't be ungrateful to Allah. The way that we should be in this life, if we really understand the reality of this life and know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with His names and attributes, if every breath we take, if every second in our life we are making remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we won't fulfill the rights of Allah upon us. But it's the mercy of Allah that He accept these simple acts of worship that He permitted us and He showed us and He commanded us to be upon. And one of which is this dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the Prophet ﷺ mentioned that also in the authentic hadith, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أَنَا عِنْدِ ظَنَّ عَبْدِي بِي, I am with my abd, my slave, the way that he think of me. فَلْيَظُنَّ عَبْدِي بِي مَا شَاءَ. So let my slave think of me the way that he wish, meaning that if you think that Allah will have mercy on you, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will have mercy on you. If you expect that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will bestow His favors upon you, He will bestow His favors upon you, because nothing is difficult for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And in the hadith, the Prophet ﷺ said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the hadith, إِذَا ذَكَرَنِي فِي نَفْسِهِ ذَكَرْتُهُ فِي نَفْسِي وَإِذَا ذَكَرَنِي فِي مَلَإٍ ذَكَرْتُهُ فِي مَلَإٍ خَيْرٍ مِّنْهِ. That means if he make remembrance of me in his own self, no one hears, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will mention the name of that slave of Allah in himself subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if that slave of Allah, that human being, make remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in a gathering, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will make mention of His name in a gathering that is better than the gathering of that human beings that were gathered, the gatherings of the angels. Which is, again, if we ask ourselves, is there anything more virtue than this? Just to be in that state where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would mention one's name. And when one of the companions of the Prophet ﷺ, the Prophet ﷺ told them that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned your name. He said, He mentioned my name. And this is something that is a continuous thing, not just to the companions radiallahu anhum. The promise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the truth. And to have husn al-dhann, the good thinking about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is part of being a believer. And this is one of the benefits of the dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that the more the person is engaged in the remembrance of Allah according to the way the Prophet ﷺ, the more the person would think good about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most merciful. And the more the person would rely upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and would detach himself from looking with his heart into his own power and might, but rather to look into the power of Allah. He wouldn't have too much concern towards others and fear of others and hope from others, but rather to turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone with fear, with hope, with love. And this is all part of the dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that we need to be indulged in. وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.